Downloadable content for a single-player video game is a strange concept. This statement isn't meant as a critique on the practice, but rather just something that I think needs to be said. I mean, really think about it. Any single-player narrative game, if structured properly, builds towards a conclusion for the player, and after it's experienced, it's done. Maybe there's some post-game content for players to clean up, hidden bosses, or early regions of the map to re-explore with late-game equipment, but the point is that the game is typically running on fumes at that point. You finish the game, put it on the shelf, and then begin playing something else. When I see an expansion for a game I've already completed, I'm typically hesitant, even if it's for a game I thoroughly enjoyed. Downloadable content asks that I give up some of my precious time to return to a game that I've already finished, likely several months earlier. Because of this, I almost never play a game's expansions unless they are already out when I'm currently playing the game. This is one of the reasons I've never fully completed The Witcher 3's expansions, despite that being one of my favorite games of all time, and hearing nothing but praise for them. This has also actively shaped my decision to wait on starting Cyberpunk 2077, despite owning it for over a year. I would rather wait until any additional content is released, that way I'll actually play it, because otherwise I won't. This might sound extreme, and maybe it is, but I don't like missing parts of games that I suspect I'm going to enjoy. I can think of a handful of moments from expansions that are among my favorite moments in all of gaming. The Citadel DLC for Mass Effect 3 immediately comes to mind. Rather than being a continuation of the core story of the game, it instead serves more as a means of saying goodbye to the many characters you, the player, have come to know over the trilogy. It should be played as an epilogue to the series because it closes the book on the story you have experienced over the course of 5 years, and I personally don't think the experience is complete without it. And by this point, you might be wondering what the hell any of this has to do with Dishonored. Well, the original game received 2 narrative expansions many months after it initially released. When taken together, these expansions, titled The Knife of Dunwall and The Brigmore Witches, tell a story centered on the assassin Daud as he investigates a mystery. I haven't given a proper spoiler warning yet, so we'll leave the synopsis there for now, but think of this as your mini warning. I won't be discussing anything specific about the plot in the next several minutes, but I will have video footage from the first 2 levels on the screen. The Knife of Dunwall was released 6 months after the main game came out, and The Brigmore Witches came an additional 4 months after that. I can say with some degree of shaky confidence that had these released at my current age, where my gaming time has become more valuable, I likely would have skipped them. Now, at the risk of sounding melodramatic, this greatly upsets me because the Daud DLCs are without doubt the best story the series has ever told. These expansions are one of the few instances in gaming where a DLC surpasses the main game, and it's not just the story either. The new levels are complex, with the 4 brand new ones being some of the best designed spaces in the entire series. The new additions to the equipment and powers are terrific and increase the options available specifically for non-lethal and stealth. Coupled with this are more creative stealth encounters, as well as several interesting new enemy types. Daud is also a more interesting protagonist than Corvo, although this one might not be fair given one is voiced and the other isn't. Despite both being the player character, they serve different functions in their respective games, and comparing them would be like comparing apples to assholes. Sure, they can both be eaten, but are we really talking about 2 things that should be compared? I personally don't think so. I'd wager that I'm not alone in being impressed by the tremendous improvements Arcane Studios made in the months between the release of the main game and the first of its expansions. It's a real achievement and should be seen as such. Almost everything is improved upon from the base game. Almost. I say this because it does have problems, some of them new and some of them familiar. The original Dishonored had a predictable story, but generally interesting side characters. We got to know Admiral Havelock, Lord Pendleton, and Overseer Martin as they sent Corvo on missions and explained their plans for the Loyalist conspiracy. Samuel, Sokolov, and Callista also stand out to me as characters that I personally cared about. Now, the Daud expansions have the opposite of this problem. Its story, centered on a mystery, is quite compelling and successfully builds tension with each mission. Its side characters, on the other hand, are either non-existent or underserved. While Daud is a better character than Corvo, it comes at the cost that he's the only character we get that's worth anything. None of the others in the expansion have any earned development, and now armed with the information about where the series goes, it's questionable if several of the characters were only here in order to set up the second game. Setting up a sequel doesn't inherently make them an issue, but it also doesn't excuse them being poorly written. I have deja vu giving this criticism here because it's exactly what I described feeling with Daud in the base game. I said that him being a great character in these expansions doesn't retroactively make him a good character in the original game. We get a repeat of this situation here with the new characters that are introduced. They might become great characters in future games, but that doesn't change that they are poorly written in this game. Additionally, there are issues with a gameplay mechanic known as the Chaos system, which tracks how you play the game in an attempt to provide consequences for your choices. If you've watched my previous video on Dishonored, you know that I both love and hate this system. I don't want to repeat myself too much from that video, so I'll just briefly say that my problems with the Chaos system boil down to it being shallow and restrictive, in that order for importance. The series does little to differentiate the Chaos system from a morality system, and in the base game, these might as well have been synonymous, as the actions that were deemed morally good, such as being non-violent, were always the low Chaos options. Now, I've had some time to reflect on this idea since my previous Dishonored video, and I want to offer an expansion for the Daud expansion, you could say.
Ironic.
To improve the Chaos system, Arcane would need to make two changes. The first is that there needs to be actual meaningful differences between low and high Chaos playthroughs, because this is how you telegraph to players that their choices matter. Having levels change drastically due to the player's Chaos would also add to the replayability of the game as an added bonus. Now, second, the series needs more complex choices for players to make that don't just center on killing someone or not. These choices also ideally shouldn't have one option that feels objectively good and one that feels objectively bad. With this in mind, it's not completely bad news with these expansions. I'm happy to report that Arcane Studios did make improvements to the Chaos system, specifically by creating more complex choices. As I've mentioned, the story of this game is about Daud unraveling a mystery, and because of this, the game de-emphasizes the classic target assassination type of mission that the main game relied heavily upon. This creates opportunity for more layered, morally gray choices that don't just revolve around dealing with a target. Now, complexity or number of choices means very little when it doesn't feel like the outcomes actually matter, and unfortunately, the developers still seem to have no interest in working towards that first suggestion. Having noticeable, significant differences occur that are driven by the player's Chaos level. The changes that do occur throughout these levels are quite small, and I would say less substantial than what was seen in the base game. The rest of the video will be an in-depth look at these things that the Daud DLCs did wrong, but also, and more importantly, the many things they did right. These expansions, more than any other game in the Dishonored series, are where Arcane Studios gets the most right with the most parts of the game. And because of this, I believe they are where we have the most to learn. Part 1 of this video is a summary and critique of the plot. This includes the beat-by-beat narration, choices, Chaos system changes, as well as the level and mission design. Part 2 will focus on the two side characters of the DLCs and the problems that each of them have. And lastly, Part 3 explains the small improvements that Arcane has made to the stealth systems from the base game. Now, I feel it's important to mention in case it wasn't initially obvious, but this video is part 2 in a series of projects that aim to examine all of the games in the Dishonored series. I made it a point to try and structure this video so it could be watched mostly separately, however, I would still recommend watching my other video first. Portions of this video will feature comparisons to the original game, as well as criticisms that I pointed out in my first video. For those interested, I've included a link to that critique in the description of this video. And one more thing, if you've not played Dishonored but the gameplay that's been running in the background seems like something you might enjoy, please stop watching this video. One of the series' greatest strengths is its level design, and getting to experience that for yourself is something I strongly recommend if you're even partially interested. Same goes if you've played Dishonored and enjoyed it but haven't yet played these expansions. Please stop watching this video. If I haven't made it clear enough already, these DLCs are fantastic, and if you are already a fan of the series, you owe it to yourself to play through them unspoiled. Consider this your full spoiler warning for both the expansions, the original game, as well as some light plot details of the sequel and its expansion game. For these last two, I'll give another spoiler warning later within the video before I get into their specifics.
I watched her bodyguard's face as they took him away. Dead eyes. I knew I'd pay for this one. Maybe I deserve to.
The improvement in storytelling is there right from the start, as the game opens to the character Daud darkly monologuing against the backdrop of him assassinating the Empress Jessamine Caldwin and kidnapping of her daughter Emily. 6 months have passed since that contract, but Daud remains haunted by his actions.
I'd killed nobles before. You could float a whaling ship, and the high-born blood I've spilled. Another noble steps in to replace the last one. All equally corrupt. Why should an empress be different? But she was.
He previously has killed noblemen and politicians and thought nothing of it, but this one lingers with him. Empress Jessamine Caldwin was a good person, and in the 6 months since her assassination, he has seen the city of Dunwall crumble. Games in the Dishonored series are always about choices and consequences, where the first game focused on this through the lens of revenge and the potential costs that come with it. This game is centered on redemption and the willingness to change. We didn't get to make the choice about murdering the Empress ourselves, and instead are in control of the journey afterwards, determining what road Daud walks. Does he truly learn something from this whole experience and grow, or is he stuck in a cycle of violence that will eventually engulf even him? In his dreams, Daud is visited by the supernatural being known as the Outsider. This strange yet powerful man is a staple of the series, with different factions in the world having different views on him. Many even debate his existence at all. He is in fact quite real and is the one who originally granted Daud the supernatural powers that have made him so talented as an assassin. The Outsider is quite selective with giving out powers and reveals that there aren't many he has granted his mark to, Daud being one of them, as well as Corvo from the original game. Here he informs Daud of the crossroads he is approaching and gives him a single clue to nudge him further on.
I'm here to give you one last gift, Daud. It's a mystery. One that starts with a name. Delilah.
As I mentioned earlier, Daud's story is divided across 2 expansions. The first part, The Knife of Dunwall, is focused on the mystery of who Delilah is, whereas the second part, The Brigmore Witches, is about discovering why the Outsider gave Daud this name to start with. Both expansions are comprised of 3 missions, 2 that take place at brand new locations not seen in the base game, and one that reuses a location but with some minor variations to it, such as time of day, type of enemies present, or an extension of the playable space. All of these levels are good in my opinion, but more importantly is that each also does something uniquely better than all of the others. They are great for different reasons. These will be part of the core discussion for this section of the video because sure, individually they make each level stand out in its own way, but when taken as a whole, they show that Arcane Studios themselves recognized many of the problems the original Dishonored had, and were actively working to improve on their formula. This brings us to the first level, titled A Captain of Industry, which sees Daud and his second-in-command, Billie Lurk, infiltrating a whaling slaughterhouse in order to gain information from the owner, a man named Bundry Rothwild. This individual has gained Daud's attention because he has a whaling vessel called the Delilah, the same name the outsider gave Daud with no context. The ship is not one of many possible leads, but rather the only lead. There isn't further explanation given, which at face value makes this seem a bit convenient. However, I'm also willing to accept that we are jumping into these characters likely after they've done some degree of investigation into the name. For the narrative to move, we can't have extensive cutscenes all about the leads they've previously ran down. However, I do think a few lines of dialogue or references to the dead ends they have encountered could have helped ground this. With that out of the way, I think this is a truly fantastic first level, likely the best first level across the entire series. It functions as a tutorial mission, yet is still complex in its design. This is something that the other game's first levels have all struggled with, making the level feel like it has exploration options, interesting choices, and is still difficult. As I'll explain, this level is successful in all of these regards, while also being one of the most visually interesting spaces in the entire series. Now, as I've said in some of my other videos, I am not an artist, so I don't feel qualified to critique the specific art direction. However, I do feel qualified to say that the aesthetic is compelling. The setting is in and around a whale slaughterhouse, and as such, there are signs of the creatures everywhere, from their carved up carcasses to their lifeless bodies lying on the docks. This fusion of nature and industry is so visually different to anything we saw in the base game that it stands out, and even amongst the other levels in these expansions. As Daud enters the streets of Slaughterhouse Row, Billie Lurk provides a relevant update for their plan. The workers of the Rothweil slaughterhouse are on strike. So while this means that the slaughterhouse will be empty of civilians, it also means that the factory has been locked down, requiring a time card to enter through the front door. Billie then leaves Daud and the players to explore the area. Again, right away, I think the improvement to enemy and situational encounters are noticeable. Your only route towards the slaughterhouse is through this narrow street, which feels initially quite similar to the mini street sections in the Sokolov abduction mission from the main game. Both of these maps forego horizontal space in exchange for vertical space. However, it's done much better here due to the thoughtful placement of higher-up catwalks that feature enemy patrols, as well as minimal routes that can be abused with your teleportation ability, Blink, even Daud's upgraded version that freezes time as you're aiming. Adding to this, there are several security devices on the street, such as an arc pylon. Getting close to this device results in it releasing a bolt of electricity that disintegrates Daud in one hit, and because of this, it serves as a hard counter to traveling along the ground floor. Finally, there is a city guard positioned at the opposite end of the street near the entrance to the slaughterhouse. This guard was always quick to catch any mistakes I made as I approached, and even quicker to trigger the alarm, which made this section particularly fun. There are 3 ways into the Rothwild slaughterhouse, with the front door being the most involved of the 3 due to it requiring a time card to be unlocked. Once in the yard, Daud can find several workers locked up in a cage.
We aren't signing anything without talking to Abigail.
What's wrong with you people? There's folks in Dunwall begging to do your job, for half your pay.
I won't let you in without a time card. But if you get us out of here, you can take mine. I'm not coming back.
While mainly serving as a means of gaining a time card, these workers also reference a character named Abigail Ames. This name drop is further reinforced near the docks, where players can find a man in a rowboat who requests that Daud locate this Abigail within the Rothwild slaughterhouse. See, this woman, Abigail Ames, is the leader of the slaughterhouse labor crews and the very reason the employees have begun striking. She has also gone missing inside. Helping the imprisoned workers is completely optional, not only because there are other means of entering the factory, but also because there is actually another method for acquiring a time card. Besides the front entrance, there are 2 alternate ways inside. The first utilizes a crane that grants access to the top floor of the slaughterhouse loading bay within, and the other is a brief route through the connecting sewers that ultimately takes players to a drainage area beneath one of the slaughter stations. The inside of the house again is quite striking, featuring acid baths, hanging fish carcasses, and the carved up flesh of the whales themselves. Another highlight of this mission is that it introduces a new enemy type, butchers that wield powerful buzzsaws. These enemies do constant damage if their saws are making contact and have the additional ability to shoot shards of metal for long-range damage. While I like the design and abilities of this enemy type, I think they are more interesting in action-oriented playthroughs given the higher chance of having to engage with them head-on where these combat differences actually matter. For example, their saws run on whale oil, and players can take advantage of this by igniting the small tanks on their back to cause them to explode. Or another example is that players can parry the buzzsaws, allowing them to temporarily avoid the damage from it. In stealth, however, the butchers function the same as almost every other enemy type, non-lethally choke them out or sleep dart them. Something that I've continued to think about as I've worked on these Dishonored projects is that the series needs more enemies that are immune to the effects of sleep darts, and I think the butchers could have been a good candidate for this. It could be visually identifiable by giving their model a bit more body armor-like equipment, indicating that it would be impossible to hit them properly, similar to what the Tallboys have. This would mean that players have to use the chokehold if they want to neutralize them non-lethally. This would be an appropriate risk versus benefit decision given the attack design of the butchers. They do high, steady damage in close quarters. It presents players both in stealth and action a choice about whether to risk engagement or not. As you enter the offices that overlook the killing and processing floors, you find the target, Bundry Rothwild, having a discussion with a woman.
How long? How much does he know by now?
Ramsey? No, this is about the workers. This is about fair pay and safe conditions.
Don't bother. You're not the first of his moles I've caught. What happened, Abigail? I trusted you. Extra elixir rations, bags of coin as bonuses. But you're about to see that my generosity is counterbalanced by a very inhumane side.
This is Abigail Ames, the leader of the laborers that work at the slaughterhouse. This is also the first point where we can see Arcane's attempts at increasing the complexity of choices offered by the expansions. Daud's main objective for this mission is to gather information about the whaling ship named the Delilah, and towards that there are multiple possibilities for completing this objective just based on what players decide to do here in this moment. Knocking Rothwild unconscious or killing him reveals that he is not the only possible source of information.
I know all about the Delilah. All of it. And I can give you exactly what you want.
Please do.
Not so fast. I need something from you in exchange.
Abigail Ames also has knowledge about the ship, but is only willing to share if Daud assists her in destroying the slaughterhouse. This requires Daud to move around the factory closing pressure valves in order to cause the building to explode. Abigail also stresses that this would help the workers of the slaughterhouse who are largely mistreated by Rothwild. Let's back up a bit though. It is not possible for Daud to convince Bundry Rothwild to give him the information freely. However, if you knock him unconscious, you can bring him to his own interrogation chair that's tucked away in the meat locker.
What's behind the name?
Choke on your own spit.
Who is Delilah?
Ha! Think I'll give up a friend at the first tickle? That's the kind of thing I'd pay your sister for down at the Golden Cat.
We'll feed you through your own factory.
After several electric shocks, Bundry gives up the information about the ship and Daud can be on his way. Also, for reference, this interrogation chair exists in the world as a means for Rothwild to force the workers into giving up their rights. I thought I should mention that because otherwise it might seem convenient that he even has this chair. So, what's the right thing to do here? Interrogating Bundry himself just harms him and is quiet, but he also runs this group of butchers like a street gang. Leaving him alive invites revenge, and with a man like him, there's certain to be collateral damage, not to mention that he could in theory inform your next target that you're coming. There's an option to knock him out once again, and this time place him in a container being shipped to the northern country of Tivia. It's implied through an in-game note that he was planning to do this very thing to Abigail Ames himself, so it is a fitting outcome. Alternatively, destroying his factory is literally an explosion, killing him and his butchers, but also ensuring that the other workers will likely find better jobs. It would also destroy one of the factories that is profiteering off the capture and torture of whales, something our own global society has largely outlawed and deemed immoral. So I ask again, what's the right thing to do here? But wait, it turns out there's actually another layer to this picture. Remember that man in the rowboat outside of the factory? When he asks you to search for Miss Ames, he informs you that she isn't a worker at the slaughterhouse, or at least not a real one.
I work for a very rich man who's keen on seeing Rothwild's business go belly up. His whole business with the strike, our doing. We got a mole on the inside, lady pretending to run the labor crews, a real talent. She could lie straight to the High Overseer's face and get away with it.
There's a rival slaughterhouse company that wants Rothwild out of business, and the labor strikes were just one piece of that plan. This is confirmed by Abigail herself later.
I was hired to get these gutless workers striking, which I did very nicely, and then destroy the slaughterhouse itself. That's where I got caught.
What about the people inside?
Growing a conscience? The factory workers are already out. My boss will hire them on, in better conditions than they'd ever see here. Not the butchers, though. They can die screaming for all I care.
It becomes hard to say if Miss Ames and her boss actually care about the workers any more than Rothwild does, especially because with less competition in the industry, they could in theory treat the workers just as badly, knowing they have no other options. Arcane even accounts for a scenario where players kill Bundry Rothwild but don't want to go along with this plan to destroy the slaughterhouse. Players can instead knock out Abigail Adams and place her in the interrogation chair, still getting the necessary information about the ship. So, one last time, what's the right thing to do here? The game labels interrogating Rothwild and leaving the factory standing as the low chaos option, which makes sense but also isn't great for the workers, or at least as far as we can tell from our limited scope. This is actually the type of scenario I think Dishonored would benefit more from: complexity. This would likely be the most thoughtfully designed choice in the entire series if it wasn't for one that occurs in the second expansion that is even better in my opinion. Now, regardless of your chosen methods, you gather the following information. Rothwild received the ship from a business partner, a barrister named Arnold Timsch, who had named it after a woman he had once been quite infatuated with. The barrister's obsession with this woman at some point shifted to fear, and he got rid of the vessel in his arrangement with Bundry Rothwild. With this information in hand, and after rescuing Billie Lurk from several overseers, Daud leaves the slaughterhouse row, turning his attention now fully towards Barrister Timsch. The second mission, titled Eminent Domain, takes Daud into Dunwall's legal district, and the level's opening narration informs us right away that Barrister Timsch is not a good man, using his legal authority and powerful position to seize the assets of those infected with the plague, as well as anyone who has wronged him. Daud has set up a meeting with the barrister's niece, who is willing to share further information about Delilah in exchange for Daud's assistance. Before we get into the specifics of this mission, this is a good spot to discuss the expansion's removal of a hub space between levels. In the base game, players would return to the Hound Pit's pub, an abandoned tavern in a quiet district between the missions. The point of this was to have the NPCs brief the next mission and give players a space to interact with these allies, as well as restock supplies. In my video on the original game, I go into detail about how, despite the hub not being perfect, it was necessary in order for players to buy into the side characters of the game. Without it, the narrative twist where your allies betray you would have felt hollow and lifeless. Unfortunately, these expansions did away with a hub world between the missions, and in turn, the very problem I identified occurs here. After completing each level, players are instead now treated to Daud monologuing over what are essentially screenshots, and afterwards are placed into a shop and upgrade menu screen. No exploring a location that changes and evolves as you progress through the story, and no additional interactions with characters like Billie Lurk, or other members of the Whaler's assassin gang. Now, to be completely fair, these video clips do provide wonderful characterization for Daud. Hearing his reflections on the story events as they are happening gives him more personality and is part of the reason he is an interesting character in this story. However, this decision to not have a hub is particularly confusing to me for two reasons. The first is that an obvious location already exists narratively, the assassin headquarters in the flooded district. We visit this location late in the main game as well as again in an upcoming mission, so it had already been designed and built. This logically makes sense as a location for Daud to return to between missions, similar to what the Hound Pit's pub was for Corvo. Second, as I alluded to moments ago, the Daud DLCs themselves have a twist within the story, but it falls completely flat, largely because there's no meaningful connections developed with the characters involved. For now, it's relevant to say that the characters in the game could have been improved had Arcane utilized a hub space between levels. They could have been greatly improved, in my opinion. With that, let's return to the second mission, which returns to the more traditional Dishonored structure of having a target that players must deal with, either through assassination or some level-dependent non-lethal method. This level differentiates itself in that it has the best designed non-lethal route in the entire series, in my opinion. As we'll see, it is quite complex and requires the completion of multiple steps in order to be successful. Additionally, it is a perfect showcase of what the non-lethal takedowns should be, a punishment that reflects the individual's crimes. As Daud exits the sewers into the legal district's waterfront, Billie Lurk informs him that his contact, the barrister's niece Talia, is waiting for him in a nearby alleyway called Trevor's Close. Now, Arcane was quite deliberate with the opening to this level, and they clearly wanted to demonstrate early the improvements they had made with the Chaos system. As such, this introduction features one of the expansion's few differences between high and low Chaos, and it's a meaningful one.
One more body shouldn't matter, right? Sounds gentle. He'll snore for an hour.
Okay, so I lied about it being meaningful, but I want you to know that this is truly one of the only changes that occurs based on your Chaos level. This. And while I'll admit that this is the least significant of the changes we do see in this expansion, I think it's still important to highlight it, if only to yet again illustrate how much of a wasted potential the Chaos system truly is. If there are only 5 changes between high and low Chaos in this entire expansion, and this is one of them, then is the Chaos system really even worth being in the game? My answer to that would likely be no, even as someone who likes the concept of the system. Now, the immediate waterfront area features a City Watch station with several patrolling guards and a wall of light security checkpoint. Past this first gate, players can quickly locate Talia Timsh. However, she isn't alone, she's being hassled by a gang member.
I'm telling you now, walk away. Go home. You're making a mistake.
Oh, yeah? How so?
I'm here to meet a man named Daud.
The great assassin? Oh, I'm really quaking in my boots now.
This level introduces players to another one of Dunwall's gangs, the Hatters, which are being introduced here but will have a much more prominent role in the second expansion. While I do like the lore and world building this new gang adds, it's disappointing that they don't have anything unique about them when it comes to combat or stealth. They function identically to the captains in the City Watch, either attacking with sword or pistol. It's very apparent that less time went into their design compared to the butchers from the previous mission. Now, in trying to keep with my philosophy of providing appropriate suggestions instead of just complaining, it could have been interesting to also give the Hatter thugs access to the choke dust powder grenades that the players get to utilize themselves. These grenades stun enemies and make them have a coughing fit, and it would have been interesting to have that turned against you, stunning you in place and giving enemies an opportunity to attack. This also makes sense because Daud doesn't wear any sort of protective mask and in theory should be getting exposed to the same chemical powder that the enemies are. Or in the same vein, maybe it could have been something that still allows movement but affects your vision for several seconds. some type of flashbang grenade or something. Or, I don't know, maybe Arcane should have pumped the gas and given these guys something outlandish, like throwable hats that have blade attachments. Just anything to make them feel unique, because it does feel odd when even the new gang we'll see in the second expansion, the Dead Eels, have combat techniques that differentiate them, and yet the Hatters don't. Upon rescuing Talia, she dictates the terms of hers and Daud's arrangement.
I require only 2 things. Get rid of my uncle, and bring me his last will and testament. In exchange, I'll tell you what you want to know about Delilah Copperspoon.
Dishonored is at its best, in my opinion, when a mission has more than one main task for players, because it typically means the complexity of the level has to be higher in order to accommodate the additional objectives. Daud needs to both get rid of the corrupt barrister Arnold Timsh, but also steal his will, which he keeps locked in a chest with only one key that he keeps on his person. This means that even if players are playing non-lethally, they still need to get close enough to the target to pickpocket this key in order to get those documents. This is something this mission does better than, say, the Golden Cat mission in the original game, where doing the non-lethal route in that mission requires no interaction with the Pendleton twins at all. The barrister resides in his estate in the legal district, but there's a problem. The entrance to the district is locked down by the city watch, thus requiring that Daud find a key in order to be able to proceed. Luckily, the Hatters in the area have stolen a key that players can find, however its location changes depending on whether you're in high or low chaos. I like this, and it's something that I wish Arcane did more of, forcing change-ups to routes based on chaos level or more broadly on choices made by the player. It makes no difference narratively, but at least spices up how players move through this section of the map. Once in the legal district proper, Daud meets an imprisoned aristocrat named Roland, who, after recognizing Daud as the legendary assassin, requests his assistance.
What do you want?
Revenge. To do to Timsh what he did to me. I want him homeless, a victim of one of his own eviction documents. I've prepared one, complete with the forged signature of the Lord Regent.
This introduces the non-lethal route for dealing with Timsh. Get him evicted and arrested in a fashion similar to what he himself does to other aristocrats. As I mentioned, I think this non-lethal is the best designed in the entire series. It requires players swap out Barrister Timsh's letter of immunity for a forgery, one that actually instructs his property be seized for plague contamination. Timsh keeps this letter on him similar to the key for his chest, and so players must find a way to get close to him without being detected. In addition to replacing this letter, players must also place a rotten and smelly sack into the basement's ventilation system that will spread the odor throughout the building and serve as the evidence of the building's contamination from the plague. The game also clarifies that this sack is not actual plague material either, so there's no moral question about infecting innocent bystanders within the building. Completing both parts successfully sets the barrister up to be arrested by the visiting military general.
Barrister Timsh, this is a letter from the Lord Regent dated a month ago, stating that your building is to be seized by the state immediately due to massive infection outbreak, and that your personal assets are forfeit if you do not comply immediately. A month ago? Are you showing me this to try to convince me that you're above the law?
What? Let me see that.
Now, one of my complaints when it came to the original game was that we, the players, weren't given enough information about several of the targets to feel confident that they were evil people that needed to be taken down. Specifically, this was the Pendleton twins and Lady Boyle. We were told by other characters that they were bad, but weren't shown that in the levels, really. So with that in mind, I think it's important for me to justify why the non-lethal takedown for Barrister Timsh makes sense and also feels warranted. Remember, the only information we receive initially is from the opening Daud monologue, as well as from the niece Talia, whose motivations could be just wanting her uncle dead for her own benefit. Now, as you explore the Timsh estate, you can learn that the barrister's mother and Talia's grandmother is not well, seemingly suffering from something comparable to dementia. However, we also learn that Barrister Timsh has taken advantage of his mother, denying her treatment that could help, making changes to her own will, and manipulating her with lies.
Mother, this is Arnold. If you happen to awaken while no one is present, I've prepared this for you, to remind you of recent events to help clear your mind and put you at ease. The plague has ended. I have married and will become Prime Minister, just as you always wanted. My sister and brother are both here and doing well. Your last will and testament has been written and approved. We all love you, Mother. Now go back to sleep.
He also is a disgusting person to those around him, evident by his coercion of a female employee to spend the night with him despite her protests.
We can share a bottle and pass the dreary hours together.
I couldn't. My husband will be waiting.
It's only just occurred to me. The late coach isn't running tonight. It's not my fault. It's the Regent. He said to keep it standing by, just in case I'm needed.
But sir, I live out past the old walls. That's why I needed it.
I know. That's why I'm concerned. The plague's headed west this past week. I've heard of weepers on Market Street, even on Finfic Lane. I'd hate to think of you making that walk alone, but you know best, I suppose. We'll make our decisions.
Yes, that's true. Sir, I think it would be my pleasure to stay with you tonight.
Good. Then it's settled.
Does this make his niece Talia a good person? I don't think so. My guess is that she wants her grandmother's will in order to make sure she herself is in it. It's revealed that Arnold Timsh had changed his mother's will so her entire inheritance would go to Delilah. And so Talia is still being motivated by wanting the inheritance herself. However, she isn't wrong that her uncle is a vile man. Dealing with the barrister and bringing Talia the will leads to her revealing what she knows about Delilah.
My uncle became infatuated, but he looked older and made us keep candles lit all night. He was afraid of the dark. One night we all went to Waverly Boyle's for a seance. It was an amusement. We didn't know what we were doing. I thought only the dead appeared at seances. But suddenly Delilah was in the room with us. My uncle nearly died of terror. She was there, but not there. We saw her as if she was very far away, standing in the old Brigmore Manor, painting at an easel, painting a name. It was your name, Daud.
This gives Daud the next breadcrumb, a potential location, the Brigmore Manor, as well as the notion that Delilah is somewhat supernatural. Barrister Timsh was afraid of this woman, something you can actually pick up on within his estate if you follow him or explore it yourself.
Delilah, listen to me. You don't understand the position I'm in. I had to say those things about you. They were saying I was crazy, or worse. Don't you know they're hanging people for witchcraft now? Last night they stopped my carriage in Holger Square. The overseers don't care about rank or a piece of paper from the Lord Regent. I don't know what you're planning, and I don't want to know.
This creates the narrative that Daud should not take this woman lightly, which the statue of Delilah even tells him itself if players choose to interact with it. This all adds up to a great level for me. It further grows the overarching mystery while also successfully developing the picture of the villain waiting for Daud at the end of this road. One thing that I do wish we got more concrete answers on in this level was why specifically Barrister Timsh grew to be afraid of Delilah, as it's mentioned a number of times but we don't get any hard details. The general speculation in the fan community is connected to the painting we see of Timsh in his estate, Delilah is a painter, and as part of the main narrative, we'll see that she can take possession of a person by performing a ritual with a painting of that specific person. Try saying that 5 times fast. Many have speculated that Delilah first began testing this spell on Arnold Timsch with the portrait she painted of him. I think this makes a lot of sense, however, I can't find any actual evidence of this in the game, nor on the game's wiki. Genuinely, if I missed something somewhere that actually establishes this is true, I would appreciate it if someone could comment and point it out to me, as it's something I would like to see. This is actually an edit-in, because during the final stages of producing this video, while replaying the final mission for specific footage, I overheard this conversation.
Our Lady is a genius. Timsch's portrait was only the beginning, a vague mesmerism. But with Emily, Delilah will extinguish the girl's spirit and inhabit her completely, own her skin and bones.
While not outright saying she took possession of Timsch, it is clear to me that that is the implication from this conversation. I just wanted to add this since it's not actually listed anywhere on the wiki for the game, but it does actually exist.
I hope that satisfies you.
The next mission is titled The Surge and is the third overall mission in the story. However, it's worth stating again that because this story is spread across 2 expansions, it also serves as the final mission for the first one. This unfortunately created a burden for it in that Arcane seemingly believed that it had to provide some sort of meaningful ending despite being only the halfway mark for the story. As I mentioned earlier in this video, there was a 4-month gap between the releases of these 2 expansions, so I don't begrudge them trying to end with some sort of cliffhanger and/or twist in order to entice players to purchase the follow-up DLC. Unfortunately, the expansion's attempt at providing this narrative punch at the end ultimately fails in my mind. I'll return to these points shortly. The previous mission ended with Daud leaving the legal district with an idea of where to find Delilah, and this mission picks up with his return to his hideout in the flooded district. Upon arriving, he finds the area overrun with overseers from the Abbey.
Master Daud, we've been attacked by overseers. The base is lost. The men are scattered, some captured by the overseers, and their leader is in your chambers as we speak.
For any watching this video that haven't played the game series, Overseers are a religious militia faction within the world of Dishonored that fight against the occult and the outsider. Because of this, Daud's band of supernatural assassins rank highly on their list of targets. Now, depending on the player's chaos, they are greeted by either Billie Lurk in low chaos or a random assassin in high chaos. Their message is the same, so it doesn't change anything if you get one versus the other. This opening conversation sets up the level's objectives: locate the Overseer assault plans, eliminate their leader, and finally rescue as many of the captured assassins as possible. This level is very similar to the Hound Pit's pub level from the base game, titled The Loyalists. Both missions see the player character return to their base of operations, which is now filled with enemies, and both missions give players the choice to rescue their allies. Players should also know both locations better than the enemy force, and so like Corvo and Daud in-game, they have the home field advantage despite being potentially outmaneuvered and outnumbered. In fact, that last sentence is specifically what I consider to be both missions' greatest and really only strength, using the player's prior knowledge of the location to outmaneuver the enemy. Because if we're being honest, and I think that we can be, both missions are their respective game's worst mission. That being said, the Surge is the better of these 2 missions. The area around the Chamber of Commerce building provides more opportunities for creative maneuverability than the space of the Hound Pit's pub. Additionally, this mission features heavily an enemy type that I thought was underutilized in the base game, the Music Box Overseers. These particular enemies have a large box strapped to their chest that releases a specific frequency of sound wave that counters the outsider's influence. Now, said in terms of gameplay, this means that your powers are nullified when overseers are using their music boxes. The mission places many of these enemies directly in your path, especially if you choose to rescue your captured assassins. The Surge also succeeds where the other mission, the Loyalists, fail because it doesn't feature an easy method of removing all of the enemies. Quite the opposite, in fact, as I found it challenging even on normal difficulty to remain undetected while also eliminating enemies. And further increasing the difficulty to the highest level, Master Assassin, provides a truly difficult experience, likely one of the hardest in the entire series, and for that reason I enjoyed it immensely. I also found it to be a good example of Arcane attempting to create better situational diversity with its stealth encounters. This mission features only 2 types of enemies, the standard Overseer and the music box variety. However, the mission never feels stale or like it's reusing encounters because of the variation in positioning, surrounding level space, enemy numbers, and patrol routes that Arcane created for each pocket of enemies within the level. The other mission objectives are straightforward and unfortunately don't offer anything unique, which is to this mission's detriment. You locate the Overseer's makeshift base in one of the abandoned buildings near the Commerce Building and gather from it that someone from within the gang provided the information to the Overseers. Your final objective is finding the leader of the assault, Overseer Humes, and he's found within Daud's office, but again he offers no difference from a regular Overseer and doesn't feature any special methods of taking him out. You either kill him or render him unconscious, and that's it. Both of these objectives feel uninspired and only here in order to increase the runtime for the level, particularly with Overseer Humes, who contributes nothing. Completing the 3 objectives leads to the end of the mission, as well as the big twist ending for the first expansion.
How did the cursed Overseers find us?
It's my fault. I told Delilah where we were hidden. She wanted me to turn on you.
You did this.
But I can't go through with it.
Stupid child. All you had to do was cut his throat.
He deserves better. I was an idiot to listen to you.
So that's your choice, then.
Billie Lurk, your right hand, betrayed you to Delilah, the woman you've been searching for. It was Delilah who orchestrated the Overseer attack, with it only failing due to the incompetence of the leader, Overseer Humes, who it turns out attacked too early in an attempt to get all of the glory for himself. The conversation that occurs here between these 3 characters has differences between low and high chaos. In low chaos, Billie more or less apologizes to Daud and puts her life in his hands, allowing players to either spare or kill her.
I forgive you. Get out of here. Leave the city. Leave my sight, Billie. I give you your life.
This contrasts to high chaos, where players are forced to fight a power-hungry Billie Lurk to the death.
I knew it would come to this, Daud. It's our nature.
Both encounters lead to a final cutscene that features the Overseer offering some commentary about Billie Lurk. Again, the player's chaos level slightly flavors these scenes, with the low chaos version focused on the mentorship between Daud and Billie, as well as her potential life after being spared. The high chaos version highlights the inevitability of Billie's betrayal and Daud's ruthlessness in his actions. And that's it. That's the end of the first expansion, The Knife of Dunwall. Now, let's get into the biggest problem for this level, the ending involving Billie Lurk and Delilah. The problem, simply put, is that Arcane's attempt to provide a twist with Billie Lurk's betrayal undercuts the looming threat of Delilah that the developers have been building. Delilah appears out of nowhere in order to reveal her evil plan and taunt you.
Everything is falling into place. Though I'd hoped the Overseers would be capable of finishing you in one try. Overseer Hume was just a little too ambitious. Fortunately, I still have one card left to play. Lurk?
Sorry, Daud, but you knew this was coming.
This twist is not well written, but more importantly, it's not well developed. It comes out of nowhere and disappears with no significance just as fast. It makes Billie Lurk look stupid and makes Delilah look weak. Specifically with Delilah, at this point we know almost nothing about her and she appears scarier because of it. She is this mysterious and haunting figure, the statue, the painting, and ultimately just the name, Delilah. This building mystery is even continued in the second expansion, where we interact with her in person exactly once, at the end. Furthermore, Billie Lurk's betrayal is driven by her impression that Daud has gone soft, which only really works narratively in a low-chaos, clean-hands playthrough where it's true. However, it's that very playthrough where she doesn't follow up on this and fight him for power. She instead bends the knee to Daud despite her correct observation about his actions. This almost certainly occurs because the developers are so afraid to have bad things occur in low chaos. Adding to this, we the players don't even know Billie Lurk that well. She gives brief commentary at specific points of interest in the previous 2 missions, but it wasn't enough to get me to care about her as a character, and so her betrayal felt hollow in addition to being poorly written. I think the easiest way to improve this mission is to have neither the betrayal nor Delilah reveal occur here. Instead, have it fully centered on trying to figure out how the Overseers found the base, which in turn would feed into the threat of Delilah and the eventual betrayal. Overseer Humes' role could be expanded to include a proper non-lethal takedown and perhaps an interrogation of him for information. This could even lead to Billie Lurk being forced to kill him so he doesn't reveal her involvement with the Overseer attack. Additionally, it could also tie into the Overseers that capture her at the end of the first mission. I initially thought these 2 events were connected and that perhaps she wasn't actually being captured at all, but rather was meeting with them. However, this doesn't seem to be the case, which makes the bit at the end of the slaughterhouse feel out of place. Again, these are just my suggestions as an amateur YouTube critic and fan of the series. I'm not a game developer. I do have additional commentary about these 2 characters, Lurk and Delilah, and specifically how I think their collective story could have been improved, but I'm going to save that for the next chapter in this video. While Billie Lurk's story is done, Delilah's isn't, and so it makes more sense to dive into it once we've wrapped up the story. So for now, let's continue into the second expansion, the Brigmore Witches.
My mother warned me never to make an enemy of a witch.
Having gained Delilah's location from Talia Timsh and having repelled the Overseer attack, Daud now turns his attention towards the Brigmore Manor. However, there's a problem.
The manor's upriver, far out past the quarantine line. I'll need a ship. I've lived in Dunwall's underworld a long time. I know the players, gang leaders, madams, corrupt officials. But what I need is a smuggler who knows the river, someone I can trust. It's a reflection of Dunwall, or perhaps myself, that after all these years, the best choice I have is Lizzie Stride, and Lizzie Stride is in jail.
Before we jump fully into the next mission, I want to emphasize something that occurs at the beginning of this expansion, a brief segment at the Whalers' base. Players are freely able to walk around within the upper floor of the Commerce Building, chatting with or listening to the various members of the Whalers. So in essence, seemingly a hub. This segment features some light changes in dialogue from Daud's followers depending on your chaos level, and it gives some much needed context to what the other members of the Whalers are thinking. This is good, but again it confuses me that it was added here instead of in the first expansion, which is where it was needed in order to build the relationship with Billie Lurk. Unfortunately, this isn't truly a hub, but rather more of a prologue for the missions in this expansion. We won't return to this space between missions, which should be considered a missed opportunity. Now, the fourth mission overall in Daud's story is titled A Stay of Execution for Lizzie, and it features a return to Coldridge Prison, the location Corvo escaped from during the first mission of the base game. This time, players must enter into the prison, locate a prisoner named Lizzie Stride, and break her out. If this sounds cool, it's because it's a very fun concept, revisiting a location from the base game but with a new, more complex purpose. This mission is helped because the location, Coldridge Prison, has been expanded upon from what was seen in the base game. The prison yard, interrogation room, and entrance corridor all return, but there is now an additional multi-leveled cell block wing, which is where players will spend much of their time during this mission. Narratively, this level takes place after Corvo has escaped in the base game, and as such, we hear about how Coldridge Prison has instituted several changes to the security systems. These include the installation of an arc pylon in the entrance corridor, loudspeakers outside that are playing the Overseer music box frequencies, and finally the setting up of a complex cell lock control system. Each of these, in theory, should increase the difficulty of this mission, but in reality, these changes do little to add meaningful challenge to the mission. This ultimately goes to my core issue with this mission, which is that it across the board fails to reach its full potential. However, I want to start off with the positives of this mission before becoming too critical. This mission's biggest success is how it iterates on several ideas that Dishonored has done previously, while also offering what I consider to be the first real taste of a flavor that Arcane has continued to cook with ever since, and that's light horror. Not true horror, but a sense of creepiness and eeriness in their games. As a side objective for this level, players can investigate the interrogation room where one of Delilah's coven sisters was being questioned by guards. It not only is creepy in and of itself, but again continues to build up the dread for Delilah and her witches.
Is she strapped in right? Good. Doesn't look like much, does she? Comfortable? All right, we'll get this done. Let's start with how you got into Dunwall Tower in the first place. Was it one of the servants that let you in? One of the guards? Let's try again. How did you... Wait. You hear a kind of ringing in your ears? What's happening to her face? Is she going to... Oh no! Oh no! Shoot her! Shoot her! Shoot!
I also stated that this mission iterates on several ideas from the base game, and being more specific, I want to highlight what I consider to be two examples of this. Let's start with the smaller of the two, the addition of the Overseer frequencies being played over the loudspeakers outside of the prison. This is a natural progression of the music box technology, and instead of it being limited to an attack from an enemy, it's used as an effect status over an entire area. It forces a change to gameplay and player thinking, which is always a hallmark of good encounter design in my opinion. The second example that illustrates how Arcane improved on previous mission ideas is actually the core setup for this mission, the extraction of the prisoner Lizzie Stride. In terms of mission objective, it plays quite similarly to the Sokolov abduction from the base game, however it feels more in-depth here despite being a smaller location. In my first Dishonored video, I go into detail about how that original mission fumbles a bit because the actual act of abducting Sokolov is too easy. He is always found in the same location, his rooftop greenhouse, and there aren't any additional security measures that players need to deal with in order to reach him. Once you've knocked him out, the exit for the level is close by, and so you largely aren't required to figure out how to navigate around enemies while carrying him. This mission fixes all of these problems. To start with, Lizzie Stride can be located in one of 6 cells spread across the 3 cell blocks, A, C, or D. There are several methods for uncovering her location, including finding the cell log record or getting the information from a guard who you can rescue from execution. This is actually the guard that gave the cell key to Corvo in the base game, and while not important in either narrative, it's a nice callback. In addition to these 2 options, players can just skulk around the prison themselves in order to locate Lizzie's cell. Having randomized mission differences such as this, or for example the Lady Boyle name and costume colors from the base game, is something that I wish Arcane would do more of in this series, as it truly creates small differences in how a level is played. Now, once Lizzie Stride is located, it's not as simple as walking in and grabbing her. Or it is, but it requires a step beforehand. Coleridge Prison has added a control system for the cells, meaning that the cells can only be opened from the control station located in the room above the yard. Players have to dial in the number for Lizzie's cell in order to unlock it and gain access, and even after finally getting in, there's a fly in the ointment.
Daud, I think
I'll have to carry her out.
Unlike the Sokolov mission, where the exit was tucked away nearby and away from the guards, carrying Lizzie Stride out requires that players make their way back through the prison and to the sewers where they initially started. If players haven't been eliminating guards up to this point and have instead just avoided them, this can make this ending section more difficult. As I'm reading this back to myself, it surprises me how much this level gets right, especially given it reuses a location and is quite small overall. However, the mission makes some mistakes that genuinely confuse me. I want to start with the largest one first, which means that I should finally talk about a new gameplay mechanic that the expansions utilize. The Daud DLCs introduce a favor system which allows players to spend coin prior to starting a mission in order to slightly tweak aspects of a level, such as opening alternative routes or including things like extra resources. This likely sounds quite engaging, and I would agree. However, this system has a massive, almost experience-breaking problem. The in-game cost of these favors is too low. This criticism might surprise some people, so I would ask that you look at these examples. This is the first mission of the first expansion. You start with 2,000 coin, and in order to buy all 3 favors, it would cost me just 375 coin. This is under a fourth of my starting money, so why would I not buy all of them? You might be thinking that I'm cherry picking, or that maybe because it's the first mission, there are likely other upgrades I would consider purchasing, so it actually is a much tougher decision. This simply isn't the case, however. Here's the favor selection screen for the 4th mission, the one we're talking about right now. Again, there are 3 favors, and buying all 3 would cost me 400 coin. The prologue segment at Daud's base prior to this gives players 500 coin to start with, so again, enough to purchase all 3 of these favors. Keep in mind as well that if players carry their save over from the first expansion, they will likely have much more money on hand. So priced as they are, it makes no sense to not buy them, especially the ones related to extra runes. Because this system is broken, it no longer functions as a way to slightly change the levels, but rather just becomes the default. I couldn't ask for a more perfect demonstration of this than one of the favors for this very mission, the Overseer Disguise. Purchasing this favor allows Daud to start the mission disguised as an Overseer, who's there to formally investigate the remains of what happened with the witch interrogation. It allows players to simply stroll right through the prison, effectively eliminating some of the difficulty from the mission. To be clear, I'm not saying that I don't like this option. I actually really like it. It's clever and alters the level experience in a good way, which I am always for. What I have a problem with is that this drastic alteration costs only 100 coins. 100 coins. The extra rune costs more than this at 200 coins. 200 is actually the most expensive any of the favors ever get. In one of my playthroughs, I typically had over 2,000 coin at the start of most missions, even with purchasing favors as well as upgrades and ammunition, and so again, it made no sense not buying them. However, it isn't as simple as just increasing the cost of the favors because they are essentially one-off mission-specific perks, and so if they are too expensive, they wouldn't be bought at all. At its core, I like this system because it provides differences to levels, and so I don't want it removed. With that in mind, I can see 3 possible solutions to the problems this system has. First, I think the favors for a level could have been randomized, perhaps with only 2 available in any given playthrough of a mission. This would mean players need to work with the favors they get dealt, similar to the randomization of which bone charms appear in a level. This would obviously work better if there were a larger pool of potential favors to pull from for each mission. Second, this system largely missed an opportunity to have your direct actions in previous missions lock or unlock different favors. This could have shaped what favors were even available for purchase and thus provide differences based on those choices. There is only one instance of this in game, which calls back players' decisions with Abigail Ames from the first mission. Third, the system could have incorporated other forms of payment for these favors, such as completion of an added side mission or theft of a particular object in game. This would add more substance to some favors and require additional work from the player. Circling back to the Overseer disguise favor in this mission, I think any one of these solutions would have helped it feel more special and not just the default option that players were always going to choose. It could have been unlocked by non-lethally dealing with the Overseers in the previous mission, or perhaps would require Daud to help another prisoner escape as a side objective. This level has a few other spots of missed potential. For instance, why didn't Arcane have the Overseer sounds playing throughout the entire prison? My guess is that they didn't think players would enjoy an entire mission where their powers were inaccessible, and I do think that that is both fair and likely correct. However, this could have been worked into the mission as a side objective, allowing players to find the controls for the sound system and shut them down if they wanted to. It also makes more sense from a world standpoint that the guards would be extremely cautious and have it playing inside the prison as well. Finally, and I'll admit that what I'm about to say is a nitpick, but I'm going to share it anyways. It feels weird to not be able to create some sort of prison riot scenario. It's not currently possible because the cell control system moves and resets too slowly, so even if you manage to release a prisoner, they typically were killed by the guards before you can free the next one. I personally would have liked some sort of emergency release option that releases everyone at once, causing chaos. I'm guessing this doesn't exist because it would remove the necessity to find Lizzie Stride's cell, but I also think a solution to that would have been to have that function locked unless the player has some sort of key that maybe a warden type character could be carrying. It would still require that player work for the option of releasing everyone at once. I even kind of wonder if this was something originally planned because there are little details in this level that don't seem to amount to anything. For example, a big part of this expansion sets up the rivalry between two gangs, Lizzie's and the Hatters. Coleridge is full of Hatter gang members, and there is even mention of one of them previously attacking Lizzie in her cell. This could serve as a good foil to the emergency release option because the Hatters could slowly make their way to Lizzie's cell and attempt to kill her in this scenario. It would also serve as a choice that could potentially have meaningful benefits or consequences for the next mission, which, as we're about to see, focuses heavily on the turf war between these two gangs. It just seems like missed potential that there's no interaction between these two gangs within the prison. Even if you release some of the Hatters, most of them do nothing. This is a good lead-in into the next mission, which is titled The Dead Eels, and I'll say right out the gate that I don't have anything substantial to critique about this level. In it, Daud is sent to deal with Lizzie Stride's once right hand, Edgar Wakefield, who took command of the gang after betraying her. This objective leads into others that involve a second street gang in the area, the Hatters. With Lizzie imprisoned, the Hatters took the opportunity to steal an engine piece from her ship, the Undine, rendering it useless. This sends Daud to the Hatters and their leader, the Geezer, in order to retrieve this ship part. However, even here there is more to this objective than how it initially appears. As I said, I don't have many things to critique this level on, as it's clearly one of the best designed missions in the entire series. I attribute this to three things. First is the location. The mission is divided into 4 areas. Draper's Ward, which is the largest and functions as sort of a no man's land as the two gangs fight for control of the area and the canal. Then there's the waterfront and the textile mill, both of which serve as a base of operations for the Dead Eels and the Hatters, respectively. And finally, you have the sewers that run beneath the textile mill, which players visit in order to restore the water to the canal. These areas are all well designed, but also visually unique to each other, as well as previous locations we've seen in the series. Even the sewers feel unique, despite there being large segments of previous levels held within sewers. Now, second is the narrative setup for the mission. The gang war backdrop for this mission is great and provides some cool moments, but even more impressive is how the mission continues to push the narrative for the overall expansion. Daud needs Lizzie to smuggle him upriver past the city quarantine lines, but is forced to deal with her second-in-command as well as fix her boat first. Keep in mind that this is on top of breaking her out of prison in the previous mission too. I say all of this because this mission could have easily felt like filler, since your goals boil down to fixing Lizzie Stride's problems and eventually the Hatter's as well. It never feels like filler, however, because it expertly expands on the tones that the DLCs have been building. This mission makes you feel uneasy throughout the length of it.
Daud, this is the second time now. I see something, or someone, out of the corner of my eye. But when I turn, they're gone. Someone is watching us.
In addition to both the dead Eel gang members and the Hatters, this is our first introduction to the Brigmore Witches, both as actual combat enemies, but also simply as a tangible presence. Throughout the mission, there are several instances that Daud can interact with members of Delilah's coven, and many succeed at being unnerving.
I think I can walk if you'll just help me up.
Are you alright?
Oh, sir, thank you for finding me. It's been awful. There are such terrible things down here. But nothing as terrible as I.
The mission is full of little details, like for instance with that example I just played, there's actually a hidden option for the encounter that requires you to explore a bit before talking to the witch.
Clever.
I almost had you, Daud. You could have had an easy death.
Tell me what Delilah's doing at Brigmore.
Similarly, the first time players are in the waterfront, they can hear dialogue about how the gang members feel like they are being watched, and even going so far as to describe the individual as a woman on one of the rooftops.
You ever get that creepy feeling of being watched? I've had that a bunch lately.
Funny you asked that. I had this feeling of eyes on me. I looked up on the roof of that building over there and...
There was a lady up there, right? I seen her too, just staring. Then she was...
gone, in a wink. Yeah, we've seen the same thing.
Well, you can see this individual for yourself, another of the Brigmore Witches. If you are quick enough to subdue her before she teleports away, you actually stop an encounter at the end of the mission where several witches attack the Undine and its crew. It's the small details like this that I consider to be one of the signatures of Arcane Studios, and it's one of the reasons I enjoy their games so much. Continuing, the third and final reason this mission is so good is because of a choice that it presents to players in the back half of the level. It is the best design choice in the entire series. The context is that as Daud seeks out the leader of the Hatters in order to retrieve the stolen engine part, he unintentionally enters into a more complex situation. See, the geezer is quite old. He's alive, but only kept that way by many machines as well as a nurse. This nurse, Nurse Trimble, has sectioned off the old gang leader and more or less taken control of the gang.
Oh, stop complaining, old man. I'm giving you a legacy. What were the Hatters before I arrived? I'll tell you. A shadow of their former selves. The butt of numerous jokes, in fact.
He agrees to return the engine coil to Daud if he can get the district's water flowing again so that the gang's machinery can work. Alternatively, if players remove or distract Trimble and talk to the geezer while he's alone, they get a very different message.
Look at the pickle I'm in. Word's out about your deal with Lizzie. I know why you're here. You want that engine coil? It's yours. You just have to do one thing, assassin. Kill me. This contraption, Trimble's machine, get it off me. Let me die. I'll give you what you want.
The geezer wants to die and is only there because Trimble has been keeping him alive to be used as a puppet. This is a great choice to give players, but this isn't why I called it the best design choice in the entire series. Nurse Trimble has created a failsafe protocol that if the geezer dies, it will flood the entire textile mill with a poisonous gas, killing everyone except for the nurse, as he alone has the antitoxin. The situation isn't just kill the geezer, but commit to killing the entire Hatter's gang, something that the old man himself isn't too bothered by.
You set me free, kid. Hatters are finished. That's good. And, something.
It's a wonderful choice because the option that feels morally right, unplugging the geezer and letting him pass, is harshly paired with killing a bunch of innocent people, although you can and likely should question if these gang members are actually innocent. Siding with Trimble is the designated low chaos option and could be argued is more morally neutral than anything because you're kind of just excusing yourself from their problem. They're only to get the ship parts. However, Trimble is very clearly abusing his position as a healthcare professional to gain immense power and profit within a street gang. We're informed that the Hatters have been producing plague shrouds out of the textile mill in order to help with the handling and burial of those infected. There's obviously a market for this given the situation in the city and could be seen as profiteering during the citywide plague. It's complex and makes the player feel bad either way, which I like. I really commend Arcane for not putting in an option that feels like you're winning. I could see a scenario where they included an option to evacuate all of the gang members out of the mill prior to pulling the plug on the geezer. This would feel like a no-brainer, morally good, yet also low chaos option. How it is much better. Whatever the players choose, they bring the engine coil back to the Undine and are able to finally make their way to Brigmore Manor. My one tiny critique for this mission is that it doesn't make sense that I can kill as many of the dead EO gang members as I like prior to reinstating Lizzie Stride as the leader, and then be fine afterwards. No one questions it. I think a stronger scenario would actually be to have Lizzie Stride flip on Daud and attempt to kill him. This would be more in line with her character and also reinforce to the player that, hey, yes, your actions have consequences. Why would the leader of this gang still help you after you murdered numerous of her lackeys? The gang already accounts for a scenario where Lizzie Stride is killed in the final encounter as well.
Captain, some of us cut our teeth on whaling ships. We don't need the eels to crew this boat. We just need the boat.
Captain?
Lizzie cannot take command at the moment.
Understood.
This could just become the default if she turns on you. Again, like I said, this is a minor critique, especially because the scenario where Daud and the whalers pilot the ship themselves renders the previous mission of breaking Lizzie out of prison effectively a waste of time, which I don't like. And with that, we are at the final mission of the DLC, titled Delilah's Masterwork. Daud has arrived at the Brigmore Manor on the outskirts of Dunwall and must finally confront Delilah. Daud, even up to this moment, still has no real understanding of why the outsider gave him Delilah's name, and so despite arriving at her base of operations, he as well as the player have no idea of what is in store for them. Daud is dropped off near the estate and informed that the front entrance to the mansion is locked, and so he either needs to find the key or another way inside. As I've done with previous levels, I want to detail what I found to be the most impactful aspect of this level, which it turns out is quite a lot actually. This level seriously impresses me, and as I've worked on these Dishonored projects, I've seen this level slowly rise to be one of my all-time favorites. Through a purely aesthetic lens, the environments, both in and out of the Brigmore Manor, feel truly unique. The overgrown courtyards and gardens are unlike anything we've seen in this series so far, and I can't think of another level that has this much green in its color palette. The actual level design feels thought out, but also more importantly, the design encourages deeper exploration despite this being the final level of the expansions. Seriously, I can't stress this enough. Getting players to want to fully explore the final level is something many games struggle with. This was one of my biggest complaints about the final mission of the base game. It doesn't feel like it warrants any sort of exploration, and instead feels like players are just being funneled to the conclusion. This level doesn't have that feeling, however. And to be clear, this isn't only because there are more runes and bone charms to collect here. While that fact certainly encourages exploration, there's no option to carry them over into a new playthrough, so they are relevant only for the duration of the mission. It's hard to make extra ability points or collectibles feel meaningful when the game is coming to a close. What truly helps the design of this level is that the space is interesting, and just being in the space builds the tension and atmosphere of the mission. There's all sorts of creepy shit everywhere, and it fully immerses you into the setting.
Please, no, don't make me eat anymore. I can't. Brother Marcus, I denounce the Abbey! Wandering gaze, lying tongue, restless hands, roving feet, rabbit.
The focus on the witches, the occult, and the light horror atmosphere is excellent and has clearly become a part of the series' identity, as apparent with the sequel as well as the follow-up game Death of the Outsider. I'd even go so far as to say that it feels like one of Arcane Studios' core identities. One of their other titles, Prey, runs with its own sci-fi flavor of these characteristics. The level consists of two locations, inside and outside of the manor. Both of these spaces are large and well designed, featuring numerous routes that players can take in order to move around the spaces. There are two possible ways into the manor, either by securing the front door key from the backyard or by activating a hidden passageway in the crypt. Both require traversing around the manor into the backyard, and this is where it makes sense to discuss the other thing that this level does quite well: enemy encounters. More specifically, however, how the enemy encounters are tied to the level design. This is going to be a bit of a long-winded example, but I assure you that there's a point at the end of it. Daud spawns in the marshes near the estate. It's very likely most players will notice the broke wooden stairway on the left and probably head that direction in order to get an above view of the surrounding area. However, moving in that direction, especially your first time playing the map, means that players will likely be forced into an engagement with a new enemy type. Observant players may notice that in front of the wooden stairway is a ring of blue flowers surrounding what looks like a skull. I did not notice this my first time playing. Once you cross the threshold of flowers, the skull activates and forms into an undead wolfhound. The wolfhound itself is incredibly easy to kill, but what makes it different is that it quickly regenerates back into the dog. In order to kill these demon wolfhounds, you have to attack the skull as it's lying on the ground itself. There is no other way of stopping the hound from returning. Even throwing the skull into the river proves futile. This is the first enemy type that has this ability, so it may throw some players off, but the game teaches you how to deal with this new enemy type away from any others. It's also teaching you to be on the lookout for these skulls, and look you will because they are sprinkled throughout this level. If players should miss this lesson, it is repeated in the graveyard a short ways away. The goal is to obviously teach players how to deal with this new enemy type in an encounter where it's easy to notice that it is regenerating. In contrast, if these enemies were introduced in a main combat encounter that included witches or other enemies, players might not notice the skulls and instead assume that there are just more dogs than there actually are, leading to confusion or perhaps death. In this way, the level design is fueled by the enemy design, which in turn is fueled by the level design again. It's a cycle, and it's excellent. Arcane really pumps the gas with this level and even plays with players' expectations a bit. Around the outside of the estate, there are statues of Delilah, which are reminiscent of the statues Daud could interact with in previous levels, like the one in the Timsh estate. This will naturally lead to players moving towards them. However, the ones in this level aren't interactable and instead function as spotlights, alerting nearby enemies to your position. This again functions to teach players something now that will become more important at the end of the mission. The witches themselves are great enemies, feeling different than what has come before, despite having what essentially boils down to the same power set as the Whaler assassins from the base game. The witches can shoot dagger-like pieces at players, summon vine tendrils from the earth that pull players in for an attack, as well as utilize a brief teleportation to reposition. The only move that I would consider truly unique is that they can perform a scream attack that functions similar to Wind Blast, knocking the players back and dealing damage. Their blink/teleportation ability does feel more substantial than it did with the Whalers, however, and it's used far more frequently both in and out of combat. This is actually another example of enemy design fueling the level design. There were often times during exploration where witches would teleport nearby as part of what seemed like a reaction test for me. This gives the witches a real presence even as you're exploring, and it forces you to be on your toes. Now, unfortunately, and I know I say this a lot, so feel free to say it with me, this level isn't perfect. There are 3 issues I have with it, 2 relating to what happens narratively in the mission, and we'll get to those shortly. However, I want to address the one other first, because it's not so much a specific critique of something within the mission, but rather something that is missing. In the base game, the final mission was the best and really only attempt the game made at saying your choices led to narrative differences. It had 2 different world states, meaning that there were 2 variants of the final mission, one for high chaos and one for low. Their overall mission objectives remained the same, but the atmosphere, weather, character interactions, and tone were starkly different. Which version players got was determined by their overall chaos value going into the last level. Well, this idea and gameplay feature is completely absent in these expansions, meaning that this final mission is the same regardless of your chaos. To be honest, I didn't notice anything different between my high and low chaos playthroughs. Same level intro, same routes, same locations for the important items. The same scripted events, think that Overseer hostage I showed earlier. Same everything. Perhaps I missed some tiny conversation between 2 Coven members that offers slightly different flavoring, but I genuinely don't believe I did. The fact that there's not really differences is extremely disappointing, as this feature in the final mission of the base game is why that mission feels special. And while this mission is far better, it feels like such a missed opportunity that nothing changes in it. I can't help but imagine a high chaos variant of this level where it's set against a blood-red twilight sky, or perhaps under a full moon with candles everywhere. A high chaos version where maybe overseers are attempting to assault the manor as well, thus requiring Daud fight against both factions at once. I understand that this suggestion might seem unfair because these are DLCs after all, and would require extra resources from Arcane to build this alternate state. But I think it's a fair criticism to bring up here because Arcane has seemingly abandoned this idea completely. Even in the sequel, your chaos level has no real impact on the presentation of the final mission, or any mission. This is one of the only meaningful as well as effective ways the series has shown the differences between the chaos levels, so like I said, it's disappointing it has never returned. Now, my other issues with this level are related to the overall conclusion to how Delilah is dealt with within the narrative, so let's continue the story. Daud manages to enter the Brigmore Manor, and after some searching, locates Delilah's art studio where he finds some disturbing evidence of what Delilah's plans are.
Emily Colvin. So Delilah wants to use Emily to become Empress.
Within her journal, Delilah writes about performing a ritual with her painting of Emily Caldwin that will allow her to possess the young Empress's body forever. Daud tracks her to her gallery and, using her magic lantern, enters into the void after her. There he is first greeted not by Delilah but by the outsider himself. This conversation serves as a good bookend to the expansions, given that it was the outsider who originally started Daud down this road.
I gave you Delilah's name, and you followed it to this moment. You see now what hangs in the balance. Emily's life, Delilah's ambition, an empire in the act of crumbling. In your long life, I've rarely seen you act with such consummate grace. I give my marks sparingly, and I don't play favorites, but I will watch this with unusual attention. The end is coming, and it's been glorious to watch you throw your will against the machinery you set into motion. All things end. All things burn to ash. But you, my friend, burn bright.
Pushing further into the void, Daud finds himself in a garden-like setting where Delilah is getting ready to begin the ritual. Players have the expected two options here, lethal or non-lethal, but there's a second set of options as well, either revealing yourself or going completely unseen. Revealing yourself leads to a brief conversation and then a fight.
Are you doing this for Emily? Don't bother. You killed her mother in front of her and sold her to a gang of murderous crooks. You think she's fit for the throne? No. The girl Emily Caldwin will have the mind of Delilah the First, who did not inherit everything she got, but came to power through the force of her own genius.
As I mentioned in my video on the base game, Dishonored's combat is at its best when you are fighting against other supernaturally powered individuals, and this fight against Delilah is no different. She makes duplicates of herself that all have the Brigmore Witch power set, and you are forced to remove each of them before you can get to her. The non-lethal route can be found if players explore the void before Delilah can complete her ritual. This is made more difficult by there being several of the Delilah detection statues from earlier in the level scattered around. Players must successfully avoid these statues and find their way to the back of the gardens, where, tucked in a corner, they can find a painting that Delilah did of the void. Delilah soon begins the ritual, and by waiting for just the right moment, players can swap out the portrait of Emily with this portrait, which Delilah won't notice until it's too late.
What? What's happening? This is all wrong! What am I becoming? Outsider's blood? Is this some trick? Daud!
This effectively traps her in the void forever. The game also accounts for a scenario where you render her unconscious before she can perform the ritual, and in that situation, Daud instead performs the reading, neutralizing Delilah in her painting. Same outcome. This is all great, by the way, the setting, the fight, the stealthing, the concept of the non-lethal, and so naturally you might be wondering exactly what my issues with it are. The first again comes down to what Arcane is willing to label as low or high chaos. I should mention that at this point there will be some light spoilers for the second game, so I've placed a timestamp on the screen of where you should jump to if you're worried about the spoilers. I'll give you a second to click on that if you need to. So I can't be convinced that leaving Delilah alive, trapped in a painting, yes, but alive, is the good/low chaos option. In fact, because of the sequel, we know that it isn't. Unfortunately, because of the sequel, we also know that sparing Delilah and trapping her in the void is the correct option, given that she returns as the primary villain for the game. Daud has seen what Delilah is capable of, especially with this ritual. Why would he leave her alive? This is simply too big of a risk and makes no sense. Delilah is a mirror for Daud in a lot of ways, using her abilities for her own gain and not really understanding or caring about the potential consequences of careless selfishness. This is Daud's whole story arc in these expansions, learning responsibility. The non lethal outcome actually muddies this message. It turns out that the moral of Daud's story isn't to be thoughtful and use your blade on those that truly deserve it in order to make the city a better place. It's instead just don't kill. Ever, at all, for any reason. It's wrong. The series is so afraid of ever saying that killing could be the right option, and because of this, it always feels sanitized. Killing Delilah is better for everyone, and it seems out of character that Daud doesn't realize this given the journey he just went on. This is the outsider's whole lesson for Daud in the story, getting him to understand why killing the Empress was different, not that all killing is wrong. With great power comes great responsibility, as Uncle Ben only ever said. I have more to say about Daud, Delilah, as well as Billie Lurk, but I want to tie off this section of the video with how the story ends in the expansion, as well as my final issue. After dealing with Delilah, players are treated to final monologues from both Daud and the outsider.
I've learned that our choices always matter. To someone. Somewhere. And sooner or later, in ways we can't always fathom, the consequences come back to us. I came from Serkonos to Dunwall as a boy, made my living as a killer, one of the few who've heard the outsider's voice. I murdered an empress, but saved her daughter, who will one day rule the Empire.
This leads to a revisit of the scene in the base game where Corvo confronts Daud in the flooded district, although this time it's from Daud's perspective. You are Daud, giving your plea to Corvo to spare your life, and depending on your chaos level, you are either spared or are not. I like repeating this scene now with the recontextualization of everything Daud has done leading up to this moment. He doesn't try to use the fact that he saved Emily or any of this information to gain leverage on Corvo, likely because it wouldn't work. Instead, he lets the Royal Protector make the decision for himself. My final issue with this mission and the story overall is that it doesn't really work in high chaos. The story that Arcane is clearly trying to tell is substantially weakened and doesn't fit within that narrative. As I've stated, Daud's story is about redemption, as well as learning responsibility for his actions, and playing in high chaos clashes with that narratively. To be clear, the ending does work. Daud specifically not finding redemption and getting killed by Corvo makes sense. However, the rest of the narrative leaves me scratching my head because this Daud likely wouldn't have cared about Delilah taking possession of Emily or the Empress's death at all for that matter. Daud is following a trail of breadcrumbs in the story that I personally don't think he would have in high chaos. And listen, I understand that the story needs to happen, so I get it, but this is just something that I noticed. The low chaos ending doesn't have these problems and tells a more cohesive story. And because of low chaos, I can leave these expansions feeling like I got not just a complete story, but a good one, and that Daud was a well-written character. Unfortunately, I can't say this same thing about any of the other secondary characters in the expansion, and I think it's time to talk more fully about this.
Lurk?
Sorry, Daud, but you knew this was coming. Even if you didn't think it was so soon. You've been slipping ever since the Empress died. It's my time now.
Ultimately, the low chaos ending is a good ending that successfully loops back into the base game story while still allowing the expansions to tell their own story of Daud's redemption and about how he got to the place of asking Corvo for mercy. In my original video, I criticized this transformation for Daud because it felt unearned, and while I think that is still true in that story, it is certainly earned in this story. This story turns out to be a key phrase here because while Daud feels like he got a complete story, both Billie, Lurk, and Delilah don't. Neither feel particularly relevant to this story. This might be surprising to hear given that Delilah is the main villain, but I assure you that it's true. Delilah is interesting, sure, but not particularly well written, and truly isn't even much of a character. She serves more as a narrative device for Daud's growth, as well as this looming presence in the distance. She works wonderfully as these things, and the game is better for it, but we just don't see enough of her to really consider her well written. This is not to say that she should have had a bigger presence either. I don't believe that that would have helped. In fact, the one other interaction we have with her outside of the ending occurs at the end of the first expansion, and it cheapens her impact in the narrative. Her appearing at Daud's base to taunt him as well as warn him to stay away feels unnecessary, makes her less interesting, and doesn't even really fit with what her apparent strengths are. She is not the sneaky assassin like Daud, and even the outsider observes the differences between them.
You have many talents, Daud, and they've served you. Delilah's talents are quite different. She creates images, but she does more. She captures spirit. She insinuates her will into her subject, whatever it is. We're witnessing her masterpiece, and perhaps yours as well.
They both are the leaders of their respective organizations, but Daud takes a more hands-on approach, getting dirty in the pigpen himself, whereas Delilah for most of the story is neither seen nor heard. She has members of her coven doing the work that needs done as she continues her own work at Brigmore Manor. Her strengths are different, and the game is effective when we see her methods contrasted against Daud's. Billie Lurk has a different problem. I spoke about her during the segment of this video that detailed the Surge mission, but to briefly restate it, it's that we don't see enough of her in the game to care about her. We see her sporadically throughout missions as she offers context clues, but these don't make her interesting or well written, and while she's not quite as bad as, say, Wallace or the other servants in the base game, she does come close. I also just can't accept how her betrayal was written. I think it might be tempting to handwave this away too, because there are only 6 levels, or perhaps because the story was divided across 2 expansions, but I don't think these are valid reasons. Specifically because Arcane chose to write the story, including the twist, the way that they did. The connection with these characters would have been built had we spent more time with them. And Arcane likely knew this because they demonstrated this very understanding in the base game. Yet they chose to ignore that lesson here. I also think that it might be tempting to label this as simply a nitpick, but I would also disagree with that as well because it directly relates to one of the 2 biggest narrative moments in these expansions, which also happen to set up plot and characters for the sequels. With that, I want to add that there will be more substantial spoilers in this chapter for both the sequel as well as its follow-up game, Death of the Outsider. They are talked about for the rest of this chapter, and so if spoilers on these 2 games are something you're concerned with, I would skip this part of the video and jump to part 3. I have a hard time accepting that Arcane genuinely thought this betrayal was a good story beat because it feels like they instead needed a cheap twist as well as were trying to set up these characters, Billie, Lurk, and Delilah, for where they needed them in the future. These 2 characters return with much greater roles in the sequel. Billie serves in the same role as Samuel, ferrying the main characters, Emily and Corvo, to and from missions, as well as offering bits of information about the locations players will be visiting. And Delilah returns again as the primary antagonist of the second game, ousting the Caldwins from Dunwall and taking the throne for herself. I think an argument could be made that Billie Lurk becomes a well-written character in the second game and its follow-up. She regrets being involved in the assassination of the Empress, and helping the Caldwins traverse the events of the sequel is her own way of making up for it. Then in Death of the Outsider, she and Daud reunite for a special mission, and it's her getting closure with Daud, who's basically her only family. These make sense and build on her character, however, these do not retroactively make her a good character in these DLCs, because she's not. Delilah actually suffers a reverse fate. She goes from being fine in this game to horribly written in the sequel. In Dishonored 2, Arcane did exactly what didn't work here. They attempted to give us more of Delilah and fill in her backstory, which fails. There's more to say about the sequels and these characters in them, but that's for another video. The point is that knowing now where the series goes, it's hard not to feel like Arcane took shortcuts in their writing in order to get these characters where they needed them to be for the sequel. It also feels strange that Billie Lurk isn't involved in the second expansion at all, given that the first puts so much emphasis on her betrayal. My first time playing this shortly after release, I kept expecting her to show back up and be involved in stopping Delilah, but she doesn't. The story feels like it's about these three characters, but then only two of them actually matter by the end. Now, keeping with my general philosophy for my critique videos, I want to provide a solution that I believe solves many of these problems with the characters, but also works largely within the structure that is already there. My big solution is to just move the Billie Lurk betrayal to the final mission right before players enter the Void at Brigmore Manor. This would feel more dramatic, first because it's the final moments of the expansion where it happens, and second because players would have had an additional 3 levels worth of interactions with Billie, and so would have in theory cared about her more. Billie would serve as Delilah's final line of defense, and so Daud approaching the painting only to get stabbed in the back by Lurk would actually feel like a betrayal. Having to duel Billie Lurk should have also been required regardless of your chaos level, because it fits narratively either way. In low chaos, she thinks Daud has gone soft, and in high chaos, she herself is power hungry. After the fight, players could still be given the choice to spare her or not, similar to the base game where players are given the choice to spare Daud. This allows for a conversation between them where in low chaos, Daud could explain why the changes he has undergone are for the better, bringing up his regret about the Empress and desire to undo some of the damage he's inadvertently caused to Emily. If she's spared, Billie could realize that she was being used by Delilah and prior to departing could explain to Daud how the witch's magic works, including how to set up the non-lethal takedown with the different painting. It thematically would fit that by sparing Billie, Daud unlocks the non-lethal takedown for Delilah. As it is in the game currently, their last exchange in the DLCs feels quite cold and leaves Billie Lurk in a position where it's confusing why she would even get involved in the sequel anyways. This would provide the missing piece as to Billie's motivations for the second game. As for Delilah, I still believe the best ending would be that Daud kills her, coming full circle in that he realizes why killing the Empress was and is different from killing Delilah. However, I recognize this likely isn't something that Arcane wanted to do, so I think trapping her within the Void serves as a fine alternative. With that though, I think it was a huge misstep for the developers to bring Delilah back for the sequels, as it not only undoes and weakens everything that Daud accomplishes in this story, but it's also out of place. The second game is centered on the Caldwins, but Delilah isn't their villain. She's Daud's, and to a lesser extent, Billie's. If she was going to return, it should have been as part of their collective story in Death of the Outsider. This much seems obvious to me. And I don't mean to sound like a smug little YouTuber, but it's particularly confusing to me how Arcane could go from the story in these expansions, which have issues sure, but are largely the best, most complete story they've ever told, into what we got with the sequel, but again, that's a discussion for another video. And with that, I think I've likely talked enough about the characters, and it's time to move on to the gameplay.
How the years pass and the bodies fall. Did you know that there are only 8 like you in the world, bearing my mark? I'm here because you're right. The Empress was different.
In my original video, I had 3 major criticisms of Dishonored's gameplay. The game's stealth systems suffer from becoming too easy too quickly. This is caused by 3 smaller issues that compound together to create the problem. The issues are as follows: resource balance, lack of encounter variety, and the stealth is mechanically basic. It makes sense to revisit these points here because some parts of these criticisms are no longer valid, while others have become more so. Like almost everything else in these expansions, Arcane has largely improved the gameplay from the base game, however, not everything has been improved. For example, my issues with the resource economy not only remain, but the introduction of the favor system potentially makes it worse. Now, not only is there the typical surplus of supplies in each level, as well as the chance to buy resources prior to starting a mission, but many of the purchasable favors add even more resources. At its core, I think I understand why Arcane makes resources so plentiful. It's so players don't feel the need to hoard and then sit on them. By throwing ammo and elixirs at players often, Arcane increases the chances that players will experiment with and use the different powers and gadgets available in the toolkit. This is valid, especially because the additions and improvements to this game's toolkit are excellent. I previously lamented that there weren't enough options available to players playing stealthily. You either used sleep darts or the sleep hold in order to render guards unconscious. Arcane obviously saw these limitations themselves because we see expansions to the non-lethal toolkit in these DLCs. 2 gadgets have been added, Choke Dust and Stun Mines, both of which add new layers for stealth non-lethal playthroughs. The Choke Dust works as a ranged option similar to the Sleep Darts, but its blast radius can hit multiple enemies at once. Its cost is that it only temporarily distracts enemies and doesn't render them unconscious at all. Stun Mines, on the other hand, are set up and left, acting like a portable, non-lethal arc pylon that shocks guards that pass within its range. The device is limited by a number of charges, and so the security it offers is temporary. Both of these tools improve the stealth mechanics and options available to players, but the largest and most impactful improvement is to the ability Blink. In the base game, Blink functioned as a teleportation ability, serving mainly as a tool for traversal and adjusting positioning. That remains true here, but now there's a big difference. Daud's version of this ability freezes time as he is aiming, and as long as the player isn't also moving. This changes the mechanics of Blink quite a bit, and for the better. It increases its utility for traversal. Players can now jump and freeze mid-air if they aren't inputting movements on the controller. This allows for more controlled and precise aiming, as well as time to decide specific positioning. This change also makes Blink far more useful in traditional stealth, as it can now be used to quickly pause time and escape if players enter the detection range of an enemy. These changes are a natural design progression for this ability, and luckily they do carry over into the sequel. Now, something I neglected talking about in my original video were bone charms, and this was intentional. While a good part of the game, I just simply didn't have much to say about them. They give incentive to fully explore a level, sure, but they are also hard to be fully invested in due to the randomization of the traits they grant. There were many times where a charm I wanted on my stealth playthrough wasn't one that I actually got, and so it's a bit of a crapshoot how useful they are in any given playthrough. This isn't a critique of this system either, more just a comment. I also didn't and still don't have any suggestions to make here because the sequel has already found the solution. It allows bone charm traits to be carried between playthroughs, and because players can craft the charms themselves, they can tailor a playthrough based upon the traits they already have collected. New to these expansions is the corrupted variant of bone charms, though, which I do have thoughts on. They typically have larger build and playstyle impacts while also usually carrying a large drawback. For example, one corrupted charm is called Statuesque and makes Daud invisible if he is standing still. This is hugely beneficial to stealth. As you can see in the footage, enemies are just walking right past me. The cost, however, is that your mana does not recharge, meaning that in theory you have to be thoughtful with your mana usage. I actually found this charm to be great even with its drawbacks because it helped counter the high number of mana elixirs found during missions, requiring me to be more deliberate than normal with what powers I used and when. This leaves just my last critique, which was about the encounter variety and with it, enemy variety. I'm quite torn here because enemy variety does feel worse. There are only 5 new enemies introduced in these expansions. You have the Witches, the Dead Eel gang members, the Hatter gang members, the Gravehounds, and the Slaughterhouse Butchers. However, only one of these is truly unique, and that's the Butchers. The Hatters function identical to the City Watch Captains. The Dead Eels function more or less the same as the Bottle Street gang members, but with an acid attack instead of a fire one. The Witches have the same powers as the Whaler Assassins, but now with the addition of the Scream attack. The Gravehounds are just unskinned wolfhounds, although I'll admit that their ability to infinitely respawn does make them unique and the better version. Compounding this lack of variety is the removal of the Tallboy, one of the base game's best enemies. They are absent from both expansions for some reason. Weepers are also all but absent, as you see a few of them in the lower levels of the waterworks during the Dead Eels mission, but nowhere else. Now, on the other hand, as I stated in my discussion of the Surge mission, I do believe Arcane has made improvements to encounter design. A few more examples of this include the final mission, where sneaking through the halls of Brigmore Manor feels different every time. This is because of the numbers, positioning, and rapid repositioning of the witches within. Another example would be during the Dead Eels mission. There is a lookout camp on one of the rooftops of Draper's Ward, which forces players to stay lower on the map until they can deal with it. So there are fewer enemies that offer a unique challenge themselves, but the enemies that are here are used far better than their counterparts in the base game. So for me, I think these factors cancel each other out if you're keeping score for whatever reason. And if you have been trying to keep score throughout this section, it should hopefully tally up to being net positive. I hope it has been clear that despite my criticisms, I really enjoy these expansions, the Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches. I'd say these expansions moved the series 2 steps forward and only 1 step back, and oh wow, look, that's the title of the video. As I stated at the beginning of this video, I am truly impressed by what Arcane Studios has done here. These expansions should be ranked highly as one of the best DLCs ever made, but also ranked highly as one of the best experiences that Arcane themselves have ever made. While Dishonored 2 may play better, I still view these Daud DLCs as the best Dishonored experience. It's why I think they should get more attention and why I decided to dedicate a whole video to them instead of just making them one part of a bigger video focused on the first game. These DLCs set the bar for what kind of story is possible in a Dishonored game, and it is unfortunately a bar that has not been met since, but hopefully someday will not only be met, but passed. We're now at the end, and first things first, I want to say thank you for watching my video. If you enjoyed it and you got some sort of value from it, hopefully you'll consider subscribing to my channel. With this video now out, I'm going to take a little break from the Dishonored series as it's been exclusively what I've focused on for the past 10 months. My plan is to do a couple videos for other games I have thoughts on, and then return to do Dishonored 2 and Death of the Outsider back to back towards the end of the summer. Some of the projects I'm currently deciding between are video critiques of The Last of Us, Hogwarts Legacy, Animal Crossing New Horizons, or Control, with Control being what I'm most likely thinking will be next. If you've stuck around this long, I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on which, if any, you'd like to see next. Finally, I have one additional comment about something from the expansions. It's a small thing that didn't cleanly fit anywhere in the script, so I'm putting it here. Holy shit, Daud's Void Sight is awful. I had completely forgotten what a step down it was from the Heart guide mechanic in the first game. I don't typically use the dark vision type powers, but you're essentially required to here in order to locate runes and bone charms. However, it was incredibly difficult to see the icons for them against the world and with the tinting. It often required me to stand in a corner staring at the wall in order to just figure out where the icons were at on my screen. This was horrible, horrible UI/gameplay design. And yeah, that's all I got. Take care.
Come sit on my lap, tough guy.